At 2:14, on the freezing night of November 14, 1943, the English Channel was less of a waterway and more of a shifting black abyss. The air temperature had plummeted to 34 degrees, and the salt spray freezing against the glass of the bridge windows sounded like a barrage of small-caliber fire. For the 28 men aboard the SC-648, survival was a matter of inches and seconds. They were currently patrolling a sector known as the Graveyard of Steel, a stretch of water where the pride of the British and American merchant fleets went to die under the relentless guns of the Kriegsmarine. But the SC-648 was not a prideful vessel. She was a 75-foot subchaser, built almost entirely of Douglas fir and yellow pine. In a war defined by the crushing weight of steel plate and the thunder of 16-inch guns, this tiny wooden boat was an anomaly, a relic of a desperate production line that the Germans found more amusing than threatening. To the crews of the Nazi destroyers prowling the Channel, these American SC-class vessels were a recurring joke. They called them floating splinters. Some German commanders, peering through their Zeiss binoculars at the diminutive silhouettes, referred to them as Yankee toys. They looked more like oversized fishing dories than instruments of sovereign naval power, with no heavy armor to speak of and a primary armament that seemed like a pea-shooter compared to the high-velocity naval rifles of the Atlantic. The subchasers were expected to do the dirty work of coastal patrol and then, quite frankly, stay out of the way. They were the Davids of the deep. But in late 1943, it seemed as though Goliath had already won the war for the Channel. The SC-648 was a particularly battered specimen of her class. Her hull was caked in layers of sea salt that even the most diligent swabbing couldn't remove, and her interior smelled perpetually of diesel fumes, stale coffee, and the damp, claustrophobic scent of wet wood. Her crew was a collection of men who didn't quite fit the mold of the spit-hand polished navy. They were led by Lieutenant Elias Thorne, a man who had spent his pre-war years navigating the treacherous currents of the Mississippi, and kept running by a head engineer who was perhaps the most dangerous man on the boat. If you want to understand how a wooden splinter managed to challenge a steel mountain, you have to understand the mind of Chief Motor Machinist's mate Jack Miller. Before the war, Miller wasn't interested in naval regulations or maritime tradition. He was a stock car mechanic from the outskirts of Detroit, a man who had spent his youth squeezing every ounce of horsepower out of rusted Ford blocks on the dirt tracks of Michigan. To Miller, an engine wasn't a piece of government property to be maintained according to a manual. It was a living, breathing entity that could be bargained with, bribed, and occasionally forced into acts of mechanical insanity. By 3 o'clock, the SC-648 was struggling. The heavy seas were punishing the small craft, and the rhythmic thrum of her main propulsion had turned into an ominous, metallic grinding. Suddenly, a violent shudder ripped through the floorboards. The port engine, a massive hunk of iron that was the boat's literal heartbeat, coughed a cloud of black acrid smoke and died. In the sudden, terrifying silence that followed, only the crashing of waves against the wooden hull remained. Without full power, the SC-648 was no longer a warship. She was a piece of driftwood, at the mercy of the currents that were pulling her closer to the occupied French coast. Lieutenant Thorne descended into the engine room, his boots sliding on the oil-slicked metal plates. The heat was suffocating, a sharp contrast to the freezing gale outside. He found Miller covered in grease up to his elbows, staring at a shattered governor assembly. The mechanical failure was catastrophic. Under normal Navy regulations, the boat was supposed to signal for a tow and wait for a repair ship, but in the middle of the English Channel, in a sector crawling with German S-boats and destroyers, a distress signal was a death sentence. Miller looked at his commanding officer with eyes reddened by fumes. He didn't offer a salute. Instead, he pointed to a pile of scavenged plumbing parts and a set of heavy-duty bypass valves he'd liberated from a supply depot in Plymouth. He told Thorne that he could get the engine back online, but it wouldn't be the engine the Navy had built. He proposed a field modification that was strictly forbidden by every technical manual in the fleet. By bypassing the engine governors and rigging a high-pressure fuel injection system using the scavenged pipes, Miller could force the engine to run at nearly double its rated RPM. It was a maneuver the crew began to call the suicide tweak. The physics were simple and terrifying. By removing the safety limits, the engine would provide a burst of speed the wooden hull was never designed to handle. However, the internal temperatures would skyrocket to the point of structural failure. The pistons would literally begin to melt within their cylinders. Miller estimated they would have maybe 20 minutes of peak performance before the entire engine block turned into a fragmented bomb, likely blowing a hole through the very wooden bottom of the boat they were trying to save. Thorne looked at the mechanic, then at the dark water visible through the small portholes. He knew the odds. He knew that the 110-foot subchaser class, though the 648 was a modified shorter variant, was never meant to engage in high-speed surface combat. But he also knew that staying still meant certain capture or death. He gave the order. For the next 4 hours, the engine room became a chaotic workshop of sparks and whispered curses. Miller and his assistants worked like demons, welding, threading, and bypassing the very soul of the ship. While the engineering team performed their mechanical alchemy, the rest of the crew prepared for the worst. They checked the depth charge racks and the small 40mm Bofors gun mounted on the deck. They were 28 men on a boat that cost less than the rudder of a battleship, yet they felt a strange, defiant pride. They were the Splinter fleet. If they were going down, they were going to make sure they were the most expensive splinter the Germans ever encountered. By 5:45, the first hint of grey light began to bleed into the eastern horizon. The modification was complete. Miller signaled the bridge. When Thorne pushed the throttles forward, the SC-648 didn't just move, she lunged. The sound was unlike anything the crew had ever heard, a high-pitched, screaming whine that vibrated through their teeth. The wooden hull groaned as the propellers bit into the water with unnatural force. They were moving at a speed that defied the vessel's design specifications, white foam arching high over the bow. But as the morning mist began to lift, the horror of their situation became clear. They weren't alone. Looming out of the fog, less than 4,000 yards away, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Kriegsmarine Type 1936A destroyer. It was a massive, steel-clad predator, over 350 feet long and armed with 5-inch guns that could turn the SC-648 into toothpicks with a single casual volley. To the German commander on that bridge, the sight of the tiny American boat must have been comical. It was a mouse stumbling into the lair of a lion. The German ship, the Z-32, didn't even bother to sound general quarters at first. Why waste the ammunition of the heavy batteries on a wooden toy? On the German deck, sailors gathered at the railing, laughing and pointing. The commander ordered the light machine gunners to take positions. He decided he wouldn't sink the Americans immediately. He would play with them. He would use the wooden boat for target practice, peppering the deck with small arms fire to watch the Yankees scramble before finally crush them under the weight of his bow. It was a display of pure, unadulterated arrogance. What the German commander didn't know was that the engine beneath the wooden deck of the SC-648 was currently screaming at a temperature that would have horrified its manufacturers. He didn't know that the man at the wheel had nothing left to lose. And most importantly, he didn't realize that in the next few minutes, the wooden toy was about to do something that defied every law of naval warfare. As the first rounds of German machine gun fire began to splinter the railings of the SC-648, Lieutenant Thorne didn't turn away. He didn't call for a smokescreen. Instead, he leaned into the voice tube and gave the most insane order of his career. He told Miller to give him everything the engine had left. He was going to charge. If this story of an impossible defiance moves you, please hit that like button to help us share the legacy of the Splinter fleet with the world. The vibration passing through the Douglas fir hull of the SC-648 was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight that threatened to shake the teeth loose from the men's jaws. On the bridge, Lieutenant Elias Thorne gripped the brass railing so hard his knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. He could feel the ship screaming beneath him. It wasn't the heroic roar of a battleship's engines. It was the frantic, agonizing wail of machinery being pushed 3 steps past its breaking point. Below decks, in the humid hell of the engine room, Chief Miller was witnessing a mechanical murder. The port engine's temperature gauge had long since buried itself past the red line, pinned at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of scorched oil and melting rubber gaskets was so thick it was a wonder the air remained breathable. Every few seconds, a jet of superheated steam would hiss from a strained joint in the improvised plumbing, filling the cramped space with a lethal mist. Miller didn't back away. He stood there with a heavy wrench in one hand and a rag in the other, literally tightening the bypass valves as they vibrated loose, gambling that the steel of the block would hold for just 1 more minute. Outside, the reality of their situation was becoming a nightmare of fire and salt. At 6:12 a.m., the distance between the tiny subchaser and the German destroyer Z-32 had closed to 2,400 yards. The Germans had stopped laughing. On the towering bridge of the Nazi vessel, Captain Hans Dietrich peered through his optics with a mixture of confusion and mounting irritation. This American boat, this Yankee toy, wasn't behaving according to the rules of engagement. It should have turned. It should have attempted to flee or surrender. Instead, it was carving through the choppy channel waters at a speed that Dietrich's tactical computer insisted was impossible for a craft of its class. The SC-648 was throwing up a massive white bow wave that nearly obscured its low-slung hull, looking less like a patrol boat and more like a torpedo aimed at the heart of the Kriegsmarine. Dietrich barked in order, and the casual atmosphere on the Z-32 vanished. The German secondary batteries, a lethal array of 37mm flak M42 guns, began to traverse. These were rapid-fire weapons designed to shred incoming aircraft, and against a wooden boat they were devastating. The first burst of fire hit the water 500 yards short, sending up towering geysers of spray that shimmered in the early morning light. The second burst was corrected with German precision. A string of high-explosive shells walked across the surface of the water and slammed into the SC-648's forward deck. The sound was like a giant sledgehammer striking a crate of dry kindling. Thousands of wood splinters, some as long as bayonets, were blasted into the air. Petty Officer Red Henderson, the 19-year-old kid from Iowa, manned the forward 40mm Bofors gun, felt a searing pain as a shard of his own ship's hull sliced through his shoulder. He didn't drop, he couldn't. He knew that if he stopped firing, the Germans would have a clean, undisturbed line of sight to the bridge. The internal monologue of the crew in those moments was a blur of terror and a strange, focused lucidity. Most of these men had been civilians 18 months ago. They were grocery clerks, high school teachers, and mechanics. Now, they were trapped on a floating tinderbox that was literally melting from the inside out, while being hammered by a steel giant from the outside. There was no room for grand philosophy. There was only the heat of the deck, the taste of salt, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the Bofors gun as Henderson hammered back at the Z-32. They felt the crushing weight of the odds. The Z-32 displaced over 3,500 tons of armored steel. The SC-648 was barely 100 tons of wood. It was like a bicycle charging a freight train. But Thorne had a secret, a piece of naval geometry that he was betting their lives on. He called it the dead zone. Every large naval vessel has a tragic flaw. The primary guns, the massive 5-inch rifles that could vaporize the SC-648, have a minimum depression angle. They are designed to hit targets miles away, not targets scraping against their own paint. Because the destroyer sat so high out of the water, if the sub-chaser could get close enough within 500 yards, the German gunners wouldn't be able to point their big guns low enough to hit them. They would be effectively invisible to the destroyer's main punch. However, getting to that 500-yard mark was a suicide mission. The SC-648 had to cross nearly 2,000 yards of open water under the focused fire of everything that C-32 could throw at them. At 6:18 a.m., another 37mm shell punched through the thin wooden skin of the radio room, turning the sensitive equipment into a tangled mess of wire and glass. The ship's cook, who had been helping pass ammunition, was knocked unconscious by the blast. The deck was now slick with a mixture of seawater, hydraulic fluid, and blood. The SC-648 was taking on water, the wooden seams opening up under the combined stress of the illegal engine speed and the concussive force of the German shells. Down in the engine room, Miller felt the hull buckle. He heard the Douglas fir ribs of the ship groaning, a sound like a forest breaking in a hurricane. He knew the engines were dying. The port engine was now spitting blue flames from its exhaust manifold, a sign that the pistons were beginning to lose their shape, dragging against the cylinder walls with every stroke. Just 2 more minutes. Miller screamed into the voice tube, his voice cracking from the heat. "She's going to blow, Captain. The block is turning into a puddle." Thorne didn't respond with a command. He responded with a maneuver. He slammed the wheel hard to port, then to starboard, zigzagging the dying boat through a forest of splashes. He was watching the Z-32's massive 150mm turrets. He saw them rotating, trying to track his erratic movements. Then he saw ether barrels dipped as low as they could go, and stopped. They were at the limit. The German gunners were frustrated, their massive shells passing harmlessly over the SC-648's mast and exploding miles away in the empty sea. The German commander, Dietrich, realized the danger too late. He saw the wooden toy disappear from his primary rangefinders. The Americans were now so close that the curvature of his own ship's hull was protecting them. He screamed for his men to use grenades, to use pistols, to do anything to stop the wooden splinter that was now less than 300 yards away and closing at a terrifying 35 knots. But the Z-32 was a ship of long-range destruction, not a street fighter. Its heavy armor was on the belt, designed to stop shells from other destroyers. But its waterline, the place where the steel met the sea, was vulnerable to a different kind of attack. Thorne reached for the release lever of an invention that would have had him court-martialed in any other circumstances. Back in the harbour at Plymouth, Miller and the gunnery mate had spent 3 nights modifying the ship's guns, the mortars used to launch depth charges. Normally, these fired in a high arc, dropping the charges hundreds of feet away to sink and explode near a submarine. But Miller had replaced the mounting brackets with a set of heavy-duty, reinforced steel plates angled nearly horizontally. They weren't going to drop these charges into the deep. They were going to fire them like massive low-velocity slugs directly into the side of the German ship. At 6:22 a.m., the SC-648 entered the final shadow of the Z-32. The German sailors were looking down from the railings, their faces pale with a sudden, icy realization. They were no longer the hunters. The tiny wooden boat was coming alongside, so close that the Americans could hear the frantic shouting of the German officers. The SC-648 was a battered, smoking wreck. Its wood shredded and its engines on the verge of a catastrophic explosion. But it was there. It had survived the gauntlet. Thorne looked up at the wall of German steel looming over them. He felt the heat of the fire on his own deck, and he felt the vibration of the engine room finally beginning to falter as the first piston seized. This was the moment. The toy was about to bite back. If you want to see the moment the Atlantic's smallest warrior took on its greatest giant, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for the next part of this incredible journey. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Thorne's dead zone gamble was a stroke of genius or pure insanity? At 6 hours 23 minutes and 14 seconds AM, the SC-648 was no longer a vessel governed by the laws of naval architecture. It was a screaming mass of overstressed wood and melting iron, held together by the sheer stubbornness of 28 men who refused to die quietly. On the bridge, Lieutenant Thorne could feel the vibrations changing. The high-pitched whine of the suicide tweak was dropping in frequency, replaced by a rhythmic, bone-jarring, metallic thud. Down in the engine room, Chief Miller knew exactly what that sound meant. The number 4 piston on the port engine had partially seized, its aluminum head expanding so rapidly from the heat that it was now shaving layers of metal off the cylinder wall with every stroke. The temperature in the engine room had climbed to a staggering 145 degrees. Miller's coveralls were soaked through with sweat and oil, and the soles of his boots were beginning to feel soft against the scorching deck plates. He had one hand wrapped in a thick rag, physically holding the throttle linkage open because the vibration had already sheared the mounting bolts. Every second he stayed in that room, he was breathing in a toxic cocktail of atomized diesel and vaporized coolant. To the men on deck, the world had narrowed down to a terrifying vertical wall of German steel. The Z-32 loomed over them, a mountain of grey armor that seemed to block out the rising sun. They were now less than 80 yards away, so close that the American sailors could look up and see the individual rivets on the destroyer's hull and the panicked, wide-eyed expressions of the German sailors leaning over the railings. The Germans were no longer laughing. The realization that this wooden toy was actually coming alongside had triggered a primal panic on the Z-32. Without the ability to depress their primary 5-inch guns, the German crew began throwing anything they could reach. Hand grenades, wrenches, and even heavy signal lamps rained down onto the SC-648's deck. One German sailor, a young man who couldn't have been older than 18, stood at the railing with a Mauser rifle, firing blindly into the SC-648's bridge. A round shattered the thick glass just inches from Thorne's head, showering him in crystalline shards. Thorne didn't flinch. He couldn't. He was focused on a single point on the Z-32's Hulver, unarmored waterline, just below the forward turret. In his mind, he was counting. He knew the SC-648 was taking on water from dozens of small-caliber hits, and he knew Miller's engines were seconds away from a total, explosive seizure. If they didn't strike now, the SC-648 would become a drifting coffin, and the Z-32 would simply reverse its engines and crush them like a bug against a wall. Internal monologues among the crew were stripped of all pretense. Red Henderson, bleeding from the shoulder but still hunched over his 40mm Bofors, wasn't thinking about the Medal of Honor. He was thinking about the smell of his mother's kitchen in Iowa and the terrifying realization that he might never see a cornfield again. He was thinking about how unfair it was that a ship this big could be defeated by a ship this small. He kept the Bofors barking, the 1.5-pound shells slamming into the German superstructure, creating a chaotic screen of fire and smoke that prevented the Nazi machine gunners from getting a clear shot at the SC-648's depth charge racks. At 6:25 a.m., the turning point arrived with a sound that signaled the end of Miller's miracle. The port engine gave a final, violent lurch. A connecting rod, weakened by the extreme heat of the suicide tweak, snapped with the force of a grenade blast, punching a hole clean through the side of the engine block. White-hot oil sprayed across the compartment, instantly igniting into a flash fire. Miller was thrown against the bulkhead, his ears ringing, and his vision swimming in red. The SC-648 began to lose momentum, its white bow wave collapsing into a sluggish ripple. They were sitting ducks, drifting alongside the massive destroyer at a distance of barely 40 yards. "Fire!" Thorne screamed into the voice tube, though the electrical system was dead and he was essentially shouting into the wind. "Fire! Everything!" On the aft deck, the gunnery mate, a man named Sullivan, who had spent 10 years on tugboats before the war, didn't need the order. He had been waiting for this exact distance. He gripped the firing lanyards for the modified Kagan. These were the weapons Miller had illegally re-engineered in the dark of a Plymouth shipyard. Instead of the standard vertical launch that would send the 300-pound Mark VI depth charges high into the air, these K-guns were mounted on horizontal shims. If you want to understand the terrifying physics of what happened next, please hit that like button. It's the only way to ensure the story of these unsung innovators reaches the audience it deserves. When Sullivan pulled the lanyards, the SC-648 recoiled, as if it had been struck by a giant. The two 300-pound canisters didn't arc gracefully into the sea. They were propelled horizontally, screaming across the short gap of water like massive, blunt-nosed torpedoes. The first charge struck the Z-32's hull, just inches, above the waterline, and bounced off the steel before rolling into the water. But the second charge was a direct hit. It wedged itself into the gap between the destroyer's hull and a protruding stabilizer fin. The explosion that followed was not a splash. It was a tectonic event. Because water is incompressible. The shock wave of a 300-pound depth charge detonating at point-blank range against a hull is infinitely more destructive than a surface hit. The energy had nowhere to go but through the Z-32. The German destroyer, a 3,500-ton mountain of steel, was physically lifted 2 feet out of the water. The shock wave ripped through the unarmored lower compartments, shattering the massive porcelain insulators in the engine room, and snapping the main drive shafts like they were toothpicks. On the SC-648, the crew was knocked flat by the concussion. The wooden boat was nearly swamped by the massive wall of water, displaced by the explosion. But as the spray cleared, a stunned silence fell over the channel. The Z-32 was no longer moving. A massive, jagged hole had been punched into its side, large enough to drive a truck through. Seawater was pouring into the German engine room at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. The proud predator of the Kriegsmarine was beginning to list heavily to port, its internal alarms wailing a mournful mechanical dirge. On the bridge of the Z-32, Captain Dietrich was thrown against his command console, his nose broken and his pride shattered. He looked out the window and saw the SC-648A, smoking, shredded, half-sunken wooden, splinter slowly drifting away. He couldn't comprehend it. His ship had the firepower to level a city block, and yet it had been crippled by a boat that looked like it belonged in a fishing harbour. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage. The German sailors, who only minutes ago were laughing and throwing wrenches, were now jumping into the freezing water in a desperate bid for survival. But the SC-648 wasn't celebrating yet. They were in a desperate struggle of their own, with one engine exploded and the other failing, and with a fire raging in the engine room. They were a miles-long target for any other German ships in the area. Miller, his face blackened by soot and his hands severely burned, crawled out of the engine room hatch. He looked at Thorne on the bridge and gave a weak, trembling thumbs up. He had given them the 20 minutes he promised. He had given them the speed, the power, and the opportunity. But now, the bill for the suicide tweak was coming due. The SC-648 was dying, but she was dying as a giant killer. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, illuminating the carnage, the men of the SC-648 realized the magnitude of what they had done. They had proven that in the chaos of naval warfare, the size of the ship matters far less than the courage of the men and the ingenuity of the modifications they are willing to make when their backs are against the wall. But the story doesn't end with the explosion. The most difficult part of their journey, the survival and the aftermath, was just beginning. Make sure you stay tuned for the final part of this journey, where we reveal the shocking fate of the crew and the official response that nearly erased this victory from the history books. Drop a comment right now. If you were in Miller's shoes, would you have pushed that engine to the point of explosion? At 6 hours, 28 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., the world was a silent grey landscape, punctuated only by the dying groans of a giant. The German destroyer Z-32, a vessel that displaced 3,500 tons and carried the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was no longer a warship. It was a 350-foot coffin, tilting 40 degrees to port. Its waterline vanished beneath a churning mixture of seawater and oil. The American subchaser SC-648 sat barely 50 yards away, its own engines finally silent, drifting in the shadow of the steel mountain it had just brought down. Lieutenant Elias Thorne stood on his shattered bridge, his face masked in soot and salt, watching as the German crew began to spill into the freezing channel like ants from a disturbed nest. But the victory was a fragile thing. The SC-648 was in no condition to celebrate. The suicide tweak had done more than just destroy the engines. It had physically compromised the structural integrity of the ship. Every time a wave hit the wooden hull, the Douglas fir ribs groaned with a sound of snapping bone. The fire in the engine room was still smouldering, and the hull was taking on water from over 40 distinct entry points, where German machine gun fire had shredded the wood. Chief Miller crawled out of the engine room hatch, his breathing ragged and his skin blistered from the radiant heat of the melting block. He looked at Thorne and simply shook his head. The port engine was a heap of slag, and the starboard engine was seized tight. They were dead in the water, 30 miles from safety, in a sector that would soon be swarming with German search planes and his boats, looking for revenge. The peak of the crisis came 10 minutes later. The Z-32, its internal bulkheads finally collapsing under the weight of the Atlantic, gave one final, violent shudder. A massive secondary explosion ripped through its aft magazine, sending a pillar of flame 500 feet into the air. The resulting shockwave slammed into the SC-648, nearly capsizing the small boat. For a moment, it seemed the Yankee toy would be dragged down by the very giant it had slain. The suction of the sinking destroyer began to pull the subchaser toward the vortex. Thorne ordered the men to use the emergency Orsony thing to push away from the dying steel. It was a pathetic, desperate sight. 28 men rowing a 100-ton warship with pieces of timber and scavenged planks, fighting the gravity of a sinking Titan. They barely made it. As the Z-32 vanished beneath the black surface of the channel, a haunting silence returned, broken only by the cries of the German survivors and the hiss of the SC-648's smouldering deck. They spent the next 4 hours in a state of suspended animation. They were a ghost ship, a collection of wood and wire that should have been at the bottom of the sea. It wasn't until 11:15 a.m. that a British motor torpedo boat, alerted by the massive explosion, spotted the smoke on the horizon. When the British commander pulled alongside, he couldn't believe his eyes. He saw a wooden subchaser, its deck caved in, its bridge shattered, and its crew looking like they had climbed out of the bowels of hell. When Thorne informed him that they had engaged and sunk a Type 1936A destroyer, the British officer laughed. He thought the Americans were suffering from shell shock. It was, quite literally, an impossible claim. The resolution of the SC-648's story, however, was not the hero's welcome the crew expected. When the boat was finally towed back into Plymouth, the atmosphere changed from triumph to cold, bureaucratic scrutiny. Within 48 hours, a team of U.S. Navy technical inspectors and high-ranking officers descended on the wooden vessel. They didn't come to congratulate the crew. They came with clipboards and frowns. They found the bypassed governors in the engine room. They found the suicide tweak plumbing that Miller had rigged using scavenged parts. They found the horizontally mounted K-guns, a modification that was a direct violation of Bureau of Ships safety regulations. To the Admiralty and the Navy brass, Thorne and Miller weren't heroes. They were liabilities. They had broken the rules, endangered government property, and utilized unauthorized field modifications that could have resulted in the loss of the ship. In the official debriefing, the sinking of the Z-32 was treated with a cold, clinical skepticism. The Navy didn't want to admit that a 75-foot wooden boat could sink a heavy destroyer using illegal tactics. It made their multi-million-dollar steel ships look unnecessary and their rigid manuals look obsolete. The official report on the Z-32's loss was quietly filed under unknown causes, likely attributed to a British minefield or a malfunctioning boiler. Lieutenant Thorne was given a formal letter of reprimand for failing to maintain his vessel according to regulations. Chief Miller, the man who had performed mechanical miracles in a furnace, was quietly transferred to a land-based repair depot in North Africa. His promotion to senior chief blocked by the very men whose lives his genius would have saved in a different context. The SC-648 itself was never repaired. The Navy deemed the hull too stressed by the illegal engine speeds to be seaworthy. She was stripped of her guns. Her engines, what was left of them, was sold for scrap, and the wooden hull that had survived the gauntlet of the Channel was burned in a salvage yard in 1946. The men went back to their lives. Miller returned to Detroit, where he spent the rest of his days working in a Ford factory, rarely speaking of the war. Thorne went back to the river, a quiet man who kept a small piece of charred Douglas fir on his desk until the day he died. For decades, the story of the SC-648 was a whisper in the halls of veteran reunions, a tall tale that younger sailors didn't quite believe, but history has a way of surfacing. In the late 1990s, a team of marine archaeologists and German naval historians began researching the wreck of the Z-32. They found the hull at the bottom of the Channel, and what they discovered changed everything. The damage wasn't consistent with a mine. It was a localized, high-pressure shockwave hit at the waterline exactly where Sullivan had aimed the modified depth charges. German survivor accounts, finely translated and cross-referenced, spoke of a mad American boat that moved with the speed of a demon and refused to die. The validation came too late for many of the crew, but for the families of the men of the SC-648, it was the final proof of what they already knew. Innovation in war doesn't happen in the boardrooms of Washington or the laboratories of the Pentagon. It happens in the grease-stained hands of a Detroit mechanic who refuses to accept. Impossible, it happens in the mind of a captain who realizes that when the rules are rigged against you, the only way to win is to break them. That is the true legacy of the David of the Deep. It's a reminder that the most powerful weapon in any navy isn't the thickness of the armor or the caliber of the guns, it's the restless, rule-breaking spirit of the human being behind the wheel. The SC-648 proved that a wooden splinter can sink a steel mountain if the man holding the splinter is crazy enough to try. If this story of forgotten heroism and the fight against bureaucracy moved you, please hit that like button. It's how we make sure these stories aren't buried by the same red tape that tried to silence the crew of the 658. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think the Navy was right to reprimand Thorne, or should he have been given the Medal of Honor? Every like and comment helps us keep these memories alive for the next generation. Thank you for watching, and remember, Sometimes the toy is the most dangerous thing in the water. You're not just a viewer. You're part of a community that values the truth over the official record. Join us next time as we dive into another forgotten chapter of history.